I'd like to welcome everyone. This is the first of three sessions that's sponsored by My Jewish Learning, and want to thank them for organizing this and for giving us the opportunity to talk about what may be on many people's minds, and something people may have wrestled with, and that is all of the Jewish traditions and practices around death and mourning. So we're going to talk about some of the traditions and give you some tips and some ideas to work with. There's a lot of material, and so I'm glad we have three parts to do it, and I hope you'll join us for the other two parts, which are coming up in the next couple of weeks. So I've sort of divided all of Jewish death and mourning practices into 14 parts. It's a sort of arbitrary number. I would have wished it'd come out with a better number, but this was, why wasn't it 10 or 613? But anyway, here's 14 for you. One of the most important things about understanding Jewish traditional practices is to understand them before you have a need for them. Now that seems like a pretty simple concept, but I have to say that many people avoid having a discussion of anything about death because either they're scared of death or because they believe if they talk about death, it's going to happen faster. So far, that hasn't been proven true based on my experience. Talking about death probably delays it rather than speeds it up. Because if it's on your mind and it's bothering you, it's a source of tension in your life. If you can sort of get it out, that's usually a good thing. So I'm going to give you examples of each of these things as we go along. And you remember, there's you can chat questions, and we'll come up with we'll respond to as many of those as we can at the end. So what does it mean to talk about death? Well, someone invented something called a death cafe. That's a really good way to enter into the conversation. A death cafe is where someone organizes an event, which used to be in a cafe, now is probably a Zoom thing, where people can just say what they want about their feelings around death, about anything that they experienced in their life. So one of the most common things that I hear from people is that they didn't get to go to a grandparent's funeral and they didn't get any kind of closure. So that's a possibility. There may be other things that people, want to express. And a death cafe is usually an unmoderated, open, undirected kind of discussion. So that's one way to begin discussions. But there are also lots of different things now, lots of tools that are out there. There's the Conversation Project, there's Last Wishes, there's Go Wish cards. I'm going to tell you about a different example. In my synagogue, the rabbi and I'm sort of representing the Chevra Kadisha, that's Holy Society that cares for people after they die. In my synagogue, the rabbi and I meet with congregants for an hour and a half, and we have a checklist of 100 items that we go through with them. We ask them, what is your Hebrew name? We ask them, do you have a will? We ask them, do you have a decision about where you want to have your funeral and where you want to be buried? And we have a discussion about cremation versus burial. And we have a full discussion about everything possible. What kind of music do you want at your funeral? What kind of prayers do you want at your funeral? What kind of poems? Who will you recommend for your pallbearers? Now, you don't have to be 90 years old to have this discussion, and you don't have to believe, you know that you can modify whatever your answers are at any point in time, but we do write them down and put them in a folder in the congregation office so that if you die, or we should say when you die, whenever that is, if your relative or child or whoever calls up the rabbi and says, I don't know what my parent or whatever your relationship wanted, we can say, well, when we had this discussion on this date, here's what they told us. And that can be very comforting for people to know that they're following the last wishes of a person who is very close to them. A part of last wishes is something called an ethical will. An ethical will is different from a physical will in that it's not the money and the property and the cars that you're leaving people, but instead an ethical will is the wisdom and the knowledge and the experience that you're leaving people. And an ethical will is something that everyone can write. You can write it for children, for grandchildren, for spouses, for nieces, for nephews, for friends, for the community. And an ethical will can be revised also. You can revise it every year on Thanksgiving, on Rosh Hashanah, on your birthday. Um, and some people write them down and give them to their friends and relatives right after they write them, and they update them every year. And other people leave it so that after they die, people will be able to read it. I think it's really interesting to share an ethical will with your family or your friends before you die, so you can hear their responses and you can modify it and enlarge on it every year. Um, all of us have knowledge and wisdom that we've gained in our lives, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to pass it on. Newer ethical wills now are not just written documents, but sometimes they're oral histories and sometimes they're videos. And I really encourage people to do videos. If you have grandchildren, they often need to do a school project. This is the perfect school project, interviewing. And my suggestion, if you're going to do interviewing, is that you do a dry run first, where you and or the other person writes out a list of questions and answers, and then you do a dry run, and then the interviewer knows which items you're going to be asked, and then if you forget or if you don't give a complete answer, then they can prompt you with a little bit more. So I'll tell you one little personal thing. My mother did a Showa interview, um, and it was back when she did it, it was on VHS tape or something like that. And we had it converted to a CD, and then we finally just said, this is crazy, and we put it on YouTube. So if you go on YouTube right now and search for my mother, Lottie Zinner, you'll hear her talk for a couple hours about her experience leaving Germany when she was 13, coming to the United States, learning English, and her whole story. And having it on YouTube makes it easy, because when someone says, tell me about your mother, I'll give them a sentence or two and then say, the rest of the story is on YouTube, go look for it. So those are the first two things, last wishes and ethical wills. There's another important thing that happens before people die, and that is called Bikur Cholim, going to visit people who are sick, and even people who are seriously ill. This is a real mitzvah, and one that used to be easy. You used to be able to just go to people's homes. Now it's not so easy, but you can still do it with Zoom. And Bikur Cholim is comforting to people, especially people who have no relatives, people who are alone. You can go and just have a pleasant conversation on Zoom or whatever technology, a telephone even, have a conversation with people. And it is comforting. When a person is seriously ill, you can do Bikur Cholim to the next level, and that is, interestingly, you can pray with them. Now, people don't think about prayer as necessarily something that non-Orthodox Jews do on a regular basis with other people, right? We think of prayer as something you do when you go to synagogue, but it's really not that difficult to learn how to do bedside prayer for someone who's seriously ill. So I'm going to give you the David Zinner 10-second version. Okay, how do you do bedside prayer for someone who's seriously ill? You ask them, how are you doing? What's happening? What do you need? And they'll say to you, this hospital bed is horrible. It doesn't have pillows, the springs or whatever. I really enjoyed when my daughter came to visit me, and I just can't wait to get a noodle kugel. I wish someone would bring it to me, right? And then how does the bedside prayer go? Let us pray together. We hope that Sarah has a new hospital bed with better springs, that her friends bring her a noodle kugel, and that you get the idea, right? Prayer can just be feedback to people on the things that they want, their desires. And it's really powerful, because at the end, what often happens is they say, wow, you got it exactly right. You knew everything. That's just amazing how you did that, you know? Um, and so, I think the feeling that you get when you are able to give people that little bit of comfort is just wonderful. Um, okay, so we're working our way through through all the different Jewish traditions and practices around death and mourning. The next one is an interesting concept. It's called vidui. Okay, vidui is often translated like the final confession. Now, people often think of confession as something that's Catholic or something like that, but we probably invented it first. Uh, so, what is the vidui like? It's basically, you know, um, itemizing your sins and asking for forgiveness. And but there are hundreds of viduis that have been written. There's a standard one, but there's hundreds of them. And if you go to a site called Vidui Variations, Julie, we need to put that link up for people on the chat. Vidui Variations, you'll see dozens and dozens of different ones. And so if you're not into talking a lot about God, there's more of an non-God vidui, but lots of variations. So I encourage you to look at those because they're sort of interesting. And they have a healing quality also. They can put people at ease. They can resolve family issues sometimes. Sometimes very good things can happen. There's a term called goses, which means the person is still alive, but they're very near death. Um, and the tradition is that as long as a person is alive and not dead, they're able to do everything as far as legal Jewish stuff that anyone else can. Um, but we recognize that when a person is goses, that they're very near death, and we need to be thinking about arrangements. And when a person dies, one of the questions is, how does the family find out? It used to be this was not a big challenging question, but in the age of coronavirus, it's taken on a whole different meaning. So notifications, if you are unable to physically visit or be with the person who's near death, this is like really difficult, really sad. Um, there is a typical notification process where if the relatives are not there, someone will either call them or call the rabbi, or there is some kind of process. But if you're working with someone, if you have a relative who is close to death, you want to find out what is the process going to be where I find out if my loved one has died if I'm not physically there. When someone dies, one of the first calls we make could be to our rabbi, or it could be to the funeral home. Funeral home logistics can be fairly complicated. If you're scheduling a funeral for someone, you have to coordinate with the funeral home, with the cemetery, with the rabbi, with the relatives, and there's a whole choreography of coordination. Hopefully the funeral home will be helpful. Funeral homes practices differ significantly around North America. Some are very attuned to what families need. Some are owned by Jews, some are not. Some have been working with Jewish families for a long time, but they may not be Jewish themselves. Um, so it's always a good thing to talk to people at your local funeral home, to find out how they function, to ask them to see a sample invoice. I want to differentiate between a price list, which is usually not very helpful because they list hundreds of prices and ranges of prices, and you really don't have much of an idea of what's going on. Much more helpful is to see a sample invoice. So you say something like, I want a simple plain casket, I want to have a funeral service, or whatever you want. We'll get more into that later, but ask them to see a sample invoice so you can understand what's happening. And some people prepay for funerals and prepay for cemetery pieces for burial. Some people own a plot. We'll get more into that in a minute. So getting a sample invoices can be very helpful. One of the questions that a funeral home may or may not ask you, and one of the terms you may or may not have heard about, is the word Tahara. Tahara is an interesting word because it's been traditionally defined as purification, but we like to define it a little bit differently. We don't think of it as just purification. We think of it as um, caring for the body by people in the community with prayer and having the person ready to go to the next place. And if you believe in God and judgment, then it's before God and judgment. Otherwise, people have different beliefs, but the community coming in and caring for the person is a really important thing for many different reasons. One is because for some people, it helps them feel a little bit more comfortable. Families gain a little bit of comfort from knowing that people from the community were caring for their loved one. And the people who do this work are often volunteers, not always, but often. And it can be very profound for them to be able to care for a person and say goodbye on behalf of the community, and do it in a way where it's very, it's done with a lot of kavanah, a lot of intention and solemnity and important prayers. Um, Now, next week we'll talk a lot about the alternative processes that we've come up with because we can't do the same kind of taharas right now that we could before. And hopefully we'll be able to do taharas the way we were doing it again after the virus stuff is over. But it's important to learn what the traditions are, and that way the alternatives to the traditions probably make more sense. The companion piece to Tahara is called Shmirah, which is ritual guarding. There's a tradition to ritually guard the body of the person who died from the time when they died until burial. This is done in some communities and not in other communities, often done by volunteers, but not always. The people who do Shmirah typically read Psalms, but they may read other things also that would be of comfort to the family, and to the person's soul. Um, and the most famous Shmirah, which you will probably remember when I say it, was during 9/11 when, after the World Trade Centers were bombed, um, the Jewish community provided Shmirah for months at the medical examiner's trailer, and people did 2-hour shifts, and the women from Stern College did Shabbat because it was close and they didn't have to drive. There's a long tradition of doing Shmirah because you're protecting the body physically from animals or body snatchers, but now it's more of an honor guard. But it's it's a practice that doesn't require any formal training. It's a practice that can be done paired up with a younger person and an adult, someone who's, for example, someone who's ready to get a driver's license. This would be a good thing for them to do with an adult, to help them think about the reality of death and hopefully teach them to drive carefully. Uh, um, or it can be done with a neighbor or a friend who may not be Jewish and pair it up with someone else, because people often want to know what they can do, and this is something they can do, and it can be very profound for people to do this kind of thing also. Um, so um, after the Tahara is done and the funeral is going to begin. Now, everything that I'm going to say now is the way it used to be and not the way that it currently is, because the way it currently is like, so out of the ordinary. For thousands of years, Jews have, done eulogies with the community present, and they've done, funerals and burials where the community was there. But we have to recognize that there were times when that wasn't done in our history too, that there were plagues, there was the Holocaust, there were, all kinds of situations where, we couldn't do it. And we're in a situation like that also now. But it's still important to remember, what our normal is. Hopefully we'll get back to our normal at some point. And our normal is that there is a funeral, and at the funeral that there's a eulogy. Where we talk about the person, and different people come and talk about them. They may have had favorite music or poems that get sung or read. Um, but typically right before the funeral, there's something called Kriya. Kriya is not the country, but um, not the countries, I should say, but it's the tearing of a garment. Um, so the typical way Korea was done was you would take a razor or a blade of some kind and make a tear, and then and the person officiating would make a tear, and then you would rip the garment. Um, some people substitute a black ribbon for that. Kriya is a really powerful kind of ritual. If you grab your garment right now and try and rip it, most of you would not be able to do it, not because you're weak, but because the material is sewn tight. Um, and when you are able to rip it, it resonates as the terror in your heart for the person who died. And so, it's I think it's really good for people to understand what Kriya is and the impact it can have, and to not do the black ribbons, because that really doesn't give you the ripping. The whole thing is about ripping. The other um, the Ecclesiastes, a time to tear and a time to mend. This is the time to tear. It's not the time to cut. And 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 then there's all these traditions around how you sew up the garment, and for whom you can sew it up, and do you sew it up tight or loose, that kind of thing. So also there's at the funeral, there's typically a eulogy. So here's the most interesting thing I've ever heard about a eulogy. A lot of eulogies go like this: he was really good, he was great, he accomplished this, he did that, right? What do you notice about that eulogy? It's in the third person, right? The most interesting eulogies I've heard are in the second person, where the person standing up in front of the congregation turns to the casket and speaks directly to the person who has died. You were my friend. You accomplished tremendous things. It changes the tone of how the whole thing works. It makes it more intimate. It makes it more personal. It's sort of like, I'm talking to you and everybody else is listening, rather than I'm talking to the congregation and we're ignoring the fact that you're there in the casket dead. So, these little things that I'm throwing out to you, I'm trying to say, here's the tradition and here's a little interesting way to approach it, so that you don't, you can read everything that I'm saying in like a Maurice Lamb book, Jewish Way of Death and Mourning, but the interesting little pieces that go along with it, how to do things a little differently, how to make things a little more meaningful, I think that's where it gets interesting. So let's talk about burial, right? You're going to the cemetery, the typical before coronavirus, there would be pallbearers, people would carry the casket to the grave. One of the things you notice about graves is that in many cemeteries there will be a lowering device made out of metal pipes, and there'll be like fake green grass and boards and stuff like that. That means the pallbearers have a really good chance of falling, because there's so many obstacles in the way. My preference is hand lowering, no device, no fake green grass, being able to see the edge of the grave so you know where not to step, right, and fall in. And hand lowering is very, very simple, and you don't get this as the casket is lowered in the lowering device. You don't get that sound. It's just like, takes like 15 seconds to lower the casket gently down. So I recommend that if you have that option, that you go for it. Burial is in different traditions. The casket is lowered and covered before the ceremony starts at the cemetery. Others, it's done later. I think it's a really important thing to shovel dirt. That's maybe because I was into gardening for a long time, and the dirt means something to me. That first shovel of dirt hitting the casket, is a sound that people don't forget easily. But I'll tell you a story about filling in the grave. When my father-in-law died, um, everyone left, but I encouraged the grandchildren um, to stay with me. And the four grandchildren and I filled in the grave, and it took us about 2 hours. Um, and they were all dressed up in their suits and fine dresses and everything, and by the time we were done, everybody was completely dirty, muddy, and whatever. But we had a chance to talk, and children often don't have a chance to talk about their feelings and about their grandparent who's died. And it's a physical thing, you sort of work out some of the grief when you're filling in the grave. So I encourage people to do that, to do more than a token shovel, but to say to the cemetery people and the funeral people ahead of time, our plan is to fill in the grave. Help us figure out how to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap this up, and we're gonna do questions in a few seconds. Shiva, um, families, the Shiva means 7, but families often do not do 7 days. But now, or I should say before coronavirus, families would often have a relative die who was out of town. So they might do 3 days out of town and then travel and then come back and do 3 days in their home community, which is sort of an interesting, way to do Shiva. I think it's a very good way. Shiva is important to understand that the purpose of Shiva is to comfort the mourners. It's not to have a party. And if you end up having to put out all the food and, make the coffee and clean up, then you're not doing Shiva in the way that it was originally constructed. Friends, relatives, whatever, should be helping, and the mourners should not be helping. They should be, talking to people. And one of the interesting things that I've seen in recent times for Shiva is that instead of doing a service and then having people go eat, what I've seen happen that really works well is stopping the service in the middle. Okay, maybe or not the exact middle, but right after the Amida, and giving the family time to talk and giving other people time to talk. And what that does is it sort of holds the space, right? It's still in the service, so people don't start going off and talking and gossiping and whatever, right? Everyone's still paying attention. So the family can tell one story and then everyone will understand the story. So holding that space, holding that the concept that, this is about the family and how we comfort them rather than this is about the big social party, is a way to proceed that might work better with Shiva. And then the last thing I want to talk about is Nichum Avelim. After the week of Shiva, people are often at a loss. I mean, they're not done grieving. They're not even barely started grieving, yet everyone's left. So that's a really important time to reach out to people and provide comfort to them, even if it's a phone call or a video chat or, whatever it is. Don't ignore people after that first week. It's going to take them time, and it's important to help them go through that process. Julie, I'm going to stop there, and if you can help me with people's questions, I'll be glad to try and answer as many as I can.
Absolutely, and people can continue to put questions in the chat box. We had a comment from Joan about the shovel size at cemeteries. I guess there's sometimes different sizes. Do you want to speak to that, David?
Shovel size. Okay. Yeah, I think it's a great idea to have different size shovels. So children can participate. People who are not as physically strong can participate. The other thing that's really interesting is people forget that you can talk to the cemetery folks or have the funeral home talk to the cemetery folks ahead of time and say, we're going to be shoveling, so try not to give us giant rocks and try not to give us piles of mud. Even if it was raining, most cemeteries have dirt, somewhere, and they can put it under a tarp so that it's physically possible to shovel. So I think that often we feel like we have to take what we get rather than be assertive, and often we regret some of what happened. And so doing some kind of advance planning, some kind of advance, when you talk to the funeral home, put this on your checklist. We do want to shovel or we don't want to shovel, but if we do, here's some of the, make it easy for us. Don't make it difficult.
And Joan was just saying that some apparently some places have miniature shovels and to request a full-size shovel.
Right. And you can feel free to bring shovels from home. That's, yeah, by miniatures, a lot of places will just have like a little basket of dirt and trowel or something like that. And if you're going to fill in the grave, that's not going to do it. So you have to sort of understand what's going to be happening and make your wishes known ahead of time.
Okay, we have a bunch of other questions. So I'm going to start with a question that was put in the chat box pretty early on. Someone who recently lost a friend, she was too sick to Zoom. She'd had a stroke and was dying of lung cancer. I couldn't visit her and couldn't communicate except by sending her voice messages and letters, but I still feel hollow about it. Any words of wisdom?
Well, coronavirus is turning everything upside down. This may not be a coronavirus case, but there's no single best approach to grieving for a friend or mourning for a friend or identifying with people's loss. Some people resonate better with groups where they can have group discussions. Some people journal. This person may have had relatives who it may be comforting to speak to the relatives. I think that you have to be willing to risk a little bit and try different options to see what's going to work for you.
The next question is, what is done with the garment that's ripped, the kriya? What do people do with that garment afterwards?
Some people put it in their closet and look at it periodically. Some people might bring it out and wear it again on the art side of the person. There's different traditions for how you sew it up. There's actually probably more written about Korea and garments than just about any other topic around death and mourning. Because in the old days you would have multiple deaths and you would do a tear for each one. And if you had so many on the front of your garment, you would turn it around and do the back. So there, and then how for a parent, you do it on one side and some non-parent on the other side. And, which ones can you sew up and not sew up? But you do what I don't think there's any strict rules about what you do with the garment afterwards.
And there's a clarification question. You mentioned a term for the time after Shiva. I don't remember what that was.
Nichum Avelim, comforting the mourners. Nichum Avelim is something that can happen anytime, right? Anytime there's a mourner, you can comfort them. My emphasis was that after the Shiva, people often forget to provide comfort on an ongoing basis. And, whether you want to invite people over for dinner after the virus is over, or just call them every Friday morning, or text with them, or whatever you want to do, I think it's really important to provide that ongoing comfort to people who've lost someone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, someone also wanted a clarification question when you were mentioning what aspect of Shmira could be done by children.
So the answer to what age one is allowed to do things, I think the answer to that has changed over time. Children are at different levels of maturity. So before coronavirus, people would say, should I take my child to the funeral? And the answer was, if they want to go, explain to them what's going to happen. And if they want to go, you should take them. But you should take them with a companion who will be responsible for them, so that if they say they want to leave, that person can walk them away and you don't have to walk away. The same thing for Shmirah. If the person is interested in doing Shmirah with you, the child, what age is appropriate, you would have to determine. A younger child, you could, bring crayons and paper and say, draw a picture of person or something, so I think it varies a lot and you really have to use your judgment.
Someone is asking if you could talk about shloshim.
Sure. Shloshim means 30, and for the first 30 days, we do things in a little less intense than we would do regularly. So for Shiva, we tend not to leave the house, which at this point doesn't make any sense, right? Because none of us are leaving our houses anyway. But the tradition is that people come to you and do services and prayers and comfort you at your house. Shloshim, you might not go to parties or weddings, or if you go to a wedding, you only stay for the ceremony, that kind of thing. The part that I didn't mention about Shiva that's usually pretty interesting is that at the end of Shiva, many people have a tradition of getting up from Shiva, that's sort of in quotes, and walking around the block to symbolize their re-entry into somewhat normal life. Shloshim, I think, is a way to sort of gradually work your way back to a little bit of normalcy, although for most people after they lose a close relative, it's not normal. It takes a long time to go to get certain pieces back, and you can't get all of them back.
David, is this good for me to read the questions from the chat box? Do you want people to be able to speak, or?
Whichever one you want to do, Julie, I'm comfortable anyway.
There's one more question in the chat box, but if there was someone who wanted to raise their hand and ask something verbally, that would be okay too. What about organ donation? How does this affect the performance of traditions or mitzvot, and what is the position on donating one's entire body?
Okay, so I want to be careful that I'm not giving positions because, the different movements have opinions, and then rabbis have opinions within those movements, but I can make some general comments about this. So I think organ donation is really important because you can save a person's life by donating your organ. If anyone knows someone who wants to donate a kidney, my son-in-law's father needs one badly, so I'm very attuned to that. And typically, if you donate an organ, which in the United States would be heart, lungs, liver, kidney, pancreas, I'm probably forgetting a few, but that kind of thing, it's done relatively quickly, and it doesn't have any impact really on the ritual washing for the Tahara, that kind of thing. Beyond organ donation, there's tissue donation, which includes things like ligaments and bones and skin. And skin donations do have an impact on Tahara because you can't really wash the body the same way if someone is a tissue donor. But tissue donation is really important. It's used for breast reconstruction and abdominal reconstruction for burn victims. So, you really are making a significant difference in someone's life if you donate organs and tissue. Donating your body to medical science is totally different because your body's basically gone for a year, and typically they insist on cremating what's left. So medical science could either be anatomy classes for doctors, or it could be, they would collect 25 elbows, and then surgeons would practice on these elbows to perfect a new surgical technique. So again, important. Also for people who just have absolutely no money, but this is a no-cost way of dying, or I should say of having your body taken care of after you die. But the question is, different places have different requirements, health and whatever. So it's certainly something that you would need to investigate in advance. And if you're going to be an organ donor, you have to make sure that your next of kin know what your wishes are, because even if on your license, driver's license, it says you're an organ donor, your next of kin can override that.
David, we have a few more questions in the chat box. The first is, does anyone say Kaddish for 12 months? There is the tradition to say Kaddish for 11 months. And the understanding of the person who wrote this is that unless the parents did something bad, but in practice, does this happen that people say Kaddish for 12 months instead of 11?
I think some people do say Kaddish for 12 months, but the differentiation is that the mourning lasts for a full year, even if you only say Kaddish for 11 months. You know, the tradition of not saying Kaddish for the full year is that, you know, it would imply that the person, you know, was not a good person. But, you know, for many of us, saying Kaddish is not something we do 3 times a day. You know, and that tradition is an interesting tradition. The one, I'll just riff on that for a second. The tradition about that I failed to mention that I should have mentioned is that Shiva and Shloshim are traditionally cut short when there's a holiday. And, you know, that can be really upsetting to people who don't have a chance to mourn because the holiday is coming, especially if it's, you know, one of those holidays that has first and second day and seventh and eighth day, you know, then you lose Shiva, potentially you lose Shiva and Shloshim. So there's a lot of traditions, and, you know, what people sometimes are looking for is permission to do what they want to do anyway. You know, if you want to say Kaddish for 12 months, you know, there's no like person who's going to come down and say you were a bad person for doing that. I mean, you know, and you know, the practice of saying Kaddish on a regular basis, I mean, it seems to me that one of the reasons that became a traditional practice was to maintain minions, right? That people who start saying Kaddish, they start becoming friendly with the other people, and then after their 11 months or 12 months, they continue because they feel obligated to the group that helped them.
Another question for you, David. What suggestions do you have for a non-married convert sitting Shiva for non-Jewish out-of-town parents?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question about what suggestions I have. I think, you know, so typically what the way that this is divided is that until the burial, the attention is paid to the person who died. And after the burial, attention is paid to the mourners, right? So what happens after the burial, it's all about the mourners. So if the mourner has not a non-Jewish parent that they're mourning for, they can do all of the traditional rituals. I'll put a period there.
Okay, great. And if there's follow-up questions, definitely you can put in the chat box. Okay, there's a few more questions. Let's see. Oh, and this is just a comment, and for anyone else who might be interested, this person says that they include Kaddish every day with other daily prayers, and now also during My Jewish Learning Minyan at 4 p.m. on Zoom. So My Jewish Learning hosts a virtual minyan every day at 4 for anyone who might be looking.
That's great.
And actually, I think that is all.
I
see one. Did I miss any of the questions?
I see one, Julie, from Cantor Mark, who wrote that his dad shocked him by giving his body to medical school since he was a member of the Chevra Kadisha. And, you know, it's really interesting how people make that decision what to do with their bodies. You know, we're going to talk in the next, the third of 3 of these sessions about ideas about cremation, ground burial, human composting, all kinds of different aspects of body disposition, I guess they call it. So, you know, how people make decisions around that and what's motivating them, what information they have to do that'll be an interesting discussion also, I think.
Great. And Abigail, did you want to say something?
Till next week. I'll wait till next week.
You'll wait till next week. Okay, I actually think that will be, that top subject is in 2 weeks from now.
Right.
Oh, okay, 2 weeks, yeah. And I was interested in cremation, basically.
Yeah, the cremation will be a very interesting topic for us to discuss. And you know, it's probably one of the more, I don't know if I would say controversial, but one of the more interesting things where I think there's a lot of misinformation about cremation that we will be able to explore. Um, Next week we're going to talk about this time we talked about the tradition mainly, right? Here's the traditional practices. Um, Next week we're going to talk about how things have changed during the era of coronavirus. You know, how Taharas have changed, how Shmira has changed, how funerals changed, burials changed, Shiva has changed. I mean, everything's changed. And you know, with all those changes, can we continue to provide comfort to people? Can we continue to observe the essence of what our traditions are? I think that's the real challenge for us.
So I had a question about a practice to get up and walk around the house 3 times after Shiva.
I think that's walk around the house is my guess is that, well, let me think about that for a second. There is a tradition of hakafot, you know, doing circles. Um, and we see this concept of circles coming up lots of times. You know, in a wedding with the bride and groom circling, in you know, Jericho circling, and you know, around the town till the walls came down. You know, circles are an interesting tradition. So I'm not sure if circles was the intent of that question, but that certainly is an interesting practice. There is also a lesser known practice of circling around the person who died after the Tahara is done. And we'll be doing a class on that in a couple of weeks if anybody's interested. It's very Kabbalistic and, you know, spiritual, you know, with the hidden name of God and things like that. But the practice of doing circling is very Jewish. Um, but it also might be just very simple that, you know, when people got up from Shiva, if it was, you know, cold and rainy and they didn't want to go outside and walk around the block, instead they might circle around inside their house. So thanks for everyone hanging in there, and I look forward to seeing everyone next time. I think your questions are great and I love them, and look forward to having this conversation again for the next couple of weeks.